Welcome, everybody, to Rated. Um, Today, we're going to be debating with Jonathan Hall over some code simplicity versus flexibility trade-offs, I guess. So on Rated here, we basically start off with a debate, and we see whether it's overrated or underrated. So I think we'll be probably saying something along the lines of code simplicity. Is it overrated or is it underrated? I'm Nicholas Hughes, CEO of EITR Technologies, and I'll be your host on this episode. In addition to arguing for the side of overrated. On the underrated side, we have our guest, Jonathan Hall. Jonathan, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, Nicholas. Thanks for having me here. Thanks for inviting me to come fight with you. So I'm Jonathan Hall. I run a YouTube channel called Boldly Go, which is about Go and all the simplicity and some of the complexity that comes with that language. And I do sort of random sorts of consulting. I help a lot of companies improve their Go code. I help improve software delivery processes and stuff like that.
Awesome. Well, buckle up and prepare for a thrilling exchange of ideas as we go toe-to-toe on this episode of Rated. So, as I said, our featured fight here is going to be simplicity versus flexibility in writing code. This was kicked off by a LinkedIn post that Jonathan had where he was talking about the simplicity of Go. And we had a little bit of back and forth, and figured we would bring it to this forum to hash it out a little bit more. Jonathan, why don't you go ahead and tell us your side as far as why you like the simplicity and why you favor code writability over readability.
Yeah, well, so I'm not sure if I completely agree with what you just said. I don't know if what you said was a misstatement or just or not. But I'll give my view, and we'll see what happens. Right.
All right.
So I believe that code readability is very important, and I believe that comes that is achieved largely through simplicity of code. And there's many ways to look at that. And one of the ways that Go looks at that is the language itself is simple. Now, you could go too far to like writing binary. That's pretty simple. It has two symbols. But I think that's a different type of simplicity than what I'm talking about.
Yeah, and I did misspeak. Apologies for that. I think the crux of it when we were talking was that I've coded in both Go and Python. Those are probably my two main languages. I've done some other JavaScript and TypeScript and things like that too. But like whenever I'm in Go, I always feel like I'm restricted, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like I have to do things a certain way. I have to handle the logic in certain ways because of, I don't know. I keep using the word restrictions, right? But like,
Mm-hmm.
the way that Go sort of keeps you in that box, right? And so I would say that I would rather have the flexibility to write the logic however I would like, over worrying about somebody coming behind me and being able to follow it easier.
Right.
I think what it comes down for me is writability basically comes to the ease of implementing the actual functionality, right? Like, are the handcuffs off? Can I get things done? Can I achieve the goal that I set out to achieve when I'm writing this? If we're looking at code readability, essentially what all that we're worried about is developer happiness after it's written, right? Like it doesn't really come down to anything having to do with the functionality itself, in my eyes.
So I think that the reason that I value readability so highly is because, I mean, as Bob Martin has put it. I don't think there's number. I don't think there's studies behind this, but his number is that we spend 10 times as much time reading code as we do writing code. And I don't know if it's exactly the right number. Maybe it's 5 times, maybe it's 15 times, depending on what you're reading. But I spend a lot of time reading code, especially when I'm on a new project, trying to understand what's going on. And I spend a very small amount of time, relatively speaking, writing code. I mean, if I knew what code to write, I would just have to type it down, and it would be quick. The hard part is well, there's two hard parts. One is understanding the current system, and then the second hard part is understanding how to manipulate that to do what I want. And sometimes that's building from scratch if we're doing a greenfield project. But the writing the code is relative to this making decisions and reading the code that's already there so that we can make those decisions. Writing code, I think, is the easiest of those three for most projects. I mean, there may be exceptions. So that's why I value code readability so highly. Understanding full well that readability is a fairly subjective term. I mean, what's readable to you may not be readable to somebody else, and depends on your seniority level and how familiar you are with the frameworks and the languages you're using and so on. But if we put all that aside and we I think it makes sense to highly value code readability, however that's defined in your context, for these reasons.
So I think, I see where you're coming from, right? As far as the time spent. But I don't know. I feel like it's spin up time on a project for me, right? Like I don't know if this is normal. But generally when I'm introduced to a new code base, right? Like I do take some time to get familiar with it. I need to figure out how things fit together. If I have specific things that I'm trying to implement, I can see where those things might hook in. And then over time, I become more and more familiar with that code base, and it becomes less of an issue. If we're talking about adding X% of ramp up time to the beginning, in order to achieve the functionality that we want to achieve easier, I think I would make that trade-off, right? Like if I'm talking about adding like, okay, if it takes me an extra 2 weeks of ramp up time, because there's always ramp up time on any project, right? A new person comes into an organization, has to learn everything new. If we say we add like 2 weeks to the front end of that, but then when people take off running, they aren't handcuffed, right? Like they can do all sorts of different things in order. I know I'm talking in vagaries, but they can do all sorts of different things in order to implement the functionality that they want to achieve. I feel like I would take that trade-off, because I don't feel like the readability concerns are going to be ever present, right? Like, and I could be way off base, but I don't think that you're going to struggle indefinitely over reading the code base and understanding it and knowing where things are, and how they tie together.
My experience has been contrary to that. And I'm talking about solo projects where I'm the only person who ever writes the code. I come back 6 months later and I don't remember what the heck I was doing. And it's like, what was I thinking? Why is this organized this way? And it's much worse on larger projects where there's 5 or 10 or 1,000 developers working, each with their own idiosyncrasies and styles and so on and so forth. Now, I don't want to go too far to I don't think we need to go so far that we enforce rules that say, for example, we only ever have one level of indentation, and functions are never more than 5 lines long. We don't need to get really ridiculous, so that whatever rule you might come up with that you might call readability. I'm not talking about that extreme, just to be clear. But maybe I can give a couple of examples of things where I think readability wins, and we can see if we agree on some of these points at least. I used to be a Perl developer. I was a Perl developer for about 10 years before I picked up Go. And Perl has this slogan called Tim Toady. It's an acronym for there's more than one way to do it. And I think they have, I'm trying to remember, they have a for loop, a while loop, an until loop, and a do loop. And I think all of those, except maybe the do loop, have a prefix and postfix version. So there's like 6 or 7, maybe 9, 10 different ways to do a loop in Perl. Go gives you one way to do a loop. I prefer the Go way for that reason. That's one example where I prefer Go, because there's for one thing, that ramp up time you're talking about, you're brand new, boot camp grad. They just have to learn one for loop and they're done. They don't have to learn all these three different ways, and they don't ever have to worry about, wait, does this block end with a while or a for or an until? They don't have to worry about jumping around the page to see, is this a loop or not a loop or whatever. It's just is obvious with Go that you have one type of loop and only one type of loop. So that's an example where, and it doesn't severely limit your flexibility. I mean, some people maybe prefer, for whatever reason, to do while true rather than for nothing, with white space there, because maybe it feels more natural or something like that. But I think once you get used to that approach, the Go approach, I've never heard anybody make an argument that having 7 or 8 different ways to do for loops is actually better, because it limits your flexibility. I've never heard that argument. Maybe somebody feels that way, but I've never heard that argument.
Yeah. So I think that Perl example might be, an extreme, like we were discussing, that is a little excessive. So I will agree to that. But, taking there's more than one way to do it, and transitioning that to our other discussion, where I was on your podcast, Ventures in DevOps, and we were talking about SALT. SALT as a framework gets a bad rap sometimes because it's hard to pick up, right? Like it's a little bit more complex than maybe some of its competitors. But I'm pretty sure that I made the argument in that discussion that that's one of the things I like about it, is that, it's this toolbox that I can do so many different things with, and I can do it so many different ways, for whatever I might need as, an integrator and developer and things like that. And so taking that same, thought process over to writing code, right? Like, I don't want to be forced into a box. And this probably is like a me thing, right? Like, that's been me my entire life. My dad told me that I should go into IT, and I immediately went in the other direction, right? So, it took me a while to get back to what I probably should have been doing. I just don't like to be told what to do. So, when Go says, hey, you got this one way that you can accomplish your goal, it's frustrating for me. But I recently had to port some code from Python over to Go. And one of the most difficult things during that process was that the Python code didn't care about types, right? Like, we could handle different things, and when it came in, we could determine what it was, through writing logic to figure out, okay, is it this, is it that, and then enter different code paths because of that. In Go, it was a little bit more difficult to have that same type of workflow, just because of it requiring types up front. Like, what are we actually going to be looking at here? So, like little things like that just make it a little bit more difficult to implement something, quick and functional, having to think through those things. I don't know, maybe it's like an integrator mindset, right? Like, I've only recently become a developer, just because it sort of forced me into that realm, right? Like, I've always been a systems guy coming up, cloud architecture and things like that, and everything's moving towards code. So it's sort of like, okay, well, now you're writing code. But I have this mindset, like, I want things that are solid and functional and fast to get done, so I can move on to the next thing. I'm not necessarily always writing, I have, but I'm not always writing like large code bases. So maybe it's that. Maybe it's me problem, Jonathan. Yeah.
Well, I've heard people not like Go and its sort of restrictiveness, for some of the same reasons you're talking about. So I'm sure you're not alone. But I think I would take your earlier example about the extra ramp up time and turn that back around on you. You talk about taking the extra time to come up with the right types and so on to do this port from Python to Go. So there's extra ramp up time, so to speak, there. But I think it has the potential to save you a lot of time in the future because and this is true of just type safety in general versus dynamic types. Is it gives you a certain amount of safety. I mean, there are restrictions, but they're there to give you the safety to allow you to move faster, so to speak. They cut down debugging time, potentially cut down a certain class of errors that can occur in your code that you never have to worry about later on. So yes, it requires a little more upfront consideration, perhaps. But unless it's just a throwaway script that you're going to run a couple of times and be done with it, it has the potential to pay off in spades over time.
Yeah, I think that the exception to that rule might be working with external data that you don't necessarily control, right?
Mm-hmm.
Type safety in that case, it might protect your code from unintended consequences, but essentially what's going to happen at that point is like, this isn't what I thought it was going to be, and it just barfs.
Mm-hmm.
And so then you have to accommodate that, right? And it's really difficult to put logic in that handles edge cases, and that's constantly where my mind is, right? Like, how could this break? How is weird stuff going to cause this to barf? And in Go, it's like, do a thing, check for error, do a thing, check for error, do a thing, check for error, right? And so it doesn't feel like it's as flexible in the sense that, like, if I'm doing the same thing with Python, it's more like check the data and then do a thing, right? As opposed to just do a thing and barf.
So that do a thing, check for error, do a thing, check for error. That's one of the most common complaints about Go. From especially, I had the same complaint. In fact, when I first started with Go, I spent some time trying to find ways to reduce that boilerplate. Stack Overflow is full of duplicate posts on the exact same topic. The internet is full of blogs about that topic. It's something that bothers everybody, it seems, when they come to Go for the first time. However, it seems that once people are accustomed to Go, they come to love that. And I have come to love that verbosity and error checking for the reason that we're talking about today, because it makes reading code readable. I never have to guess, is this function going to throw an exception behind the scenes or do something I don't expect? It's right there in front of my face. It just tells me there's an error, there's a possible error here, do something with it. Now, yes, maybe I have to copy that 1,500 times in my code, and it takes longer to type unless you're using Copilot or something, which maybe makes it faster. But getting back to what are we optimizing for? I believe we should optimize for readability because we spend so much more time doing that. And when I'm debugging a piece of Go code or just trying to figure out how to extend it to add my new capabilities, I love that those errors are right there in my face, waving their flags at me, telling me what's going on. And I never have to drill down into those function calls to see if they might throw an exception or something like that. It's just right there in my face.
Yeah, I can see that. I guess it's a scenario where, as we said in your LinkedIn post, right? There are trade-offs on both sides, and it's probably dependent upon who's doing the work, how does the organization fit together, how big is the code base, who's going to need to come back and read this later. Like you said, is it a quick and dirty thing that's probably just going to get thrown away after? I guess those would probably be considerations going into picking a language in the first place, right?
Sure. I mean, I write a lot of bash scripts, but I don't commit very many of them to Git. Some of them, but not very many. So one argument I hear against the code readability position is that of performance, which is not really the position you're taking. but there was a blog post or a YouTube video recently, a couple months ago, somebody all up in arms against the idea of clean code because it makes code less performant. Now, I don't know if that's true. I mean, in my experience, it's not entirely true, but let's put that aside. Let's say that it is true that readable code is less performant than highly optimized code. I'm willing to grant that as for the sake of argument. But most of our code doesn't need to be highly performant. Most of our code is executed, if we use the 80-20 rule, we can assume that roughly 20% of our code is executed 80% of the time, and the other 80% of our code is almost never executed. It's startup code or something like that. You start the service and we load a bunch of config files and we do some stuff, we put things in the right place, and then we start doing stuff. So 80% of our code never needs to be optimized for performance anyway. Mm-hmm. So wouldn't it make sense to optimize that for something that's important? Like maybe it's readability, maybe it's writability, but whatever it is, it's not performance. So the approach I take is to make readability the highest priority until proven otherwise. Once I know that a benchmark proves that I need to optimize performance because I have a tight loop here that's doing some event polling or something like that, then I'll optimize that and then I'll sacrifice readability in those cases. But it's rare that happens. And then you have people arguing about whether or not performance matters. Should we tweak this Node.js code just slightly? Like if you're using Node.js in the first place, performance probably isn't your highest concern, at least from the company standpoint, or they would have had you writing in Rust or something.
Yeah. As far as the scenario goes, right? I can think of one example where that would probably ring true. And that would be like Python list comprehensions, right? So, if you have readable code, your loops would, be like for whatever, and then, do a thing inside of that. And that makes sense, right? But then, if you're doing a list comprehension and you just have your brackets and, you maybe have a bunch of like decision points inside of that, list comprehension is going to be faster than running through your for loop generally. Mm-hmm. But it's also a heck of a lot harder to sort of understand what's going on. So that might have been the point that the person was trying to make, was that, you can get those performance gains by doing things like that. Yeah. But I think that I definitely agree with the fact that, like, generally most of your code doesn't need to be performant. People often talk about the performance of this or that little piece of a thing. Like I'm involved in open source communities, and you see it on PRs all the time. So somebody arguing over this one little implementation, like, oh well, if you time that operation right, like it would be X number of nanoseconds more longer to actually execute than if you did it this way, so we should do that. And like nitpicking over those little things, like, is rarely something that is fruitful.
I agree. Yeah.
But the other thing that I could argue on the other side, my wife likes to say that I'm the worst devil's advocate in the world because I always think about other things, and she doesn't necessarily want to hear that. But on the other side of it, if you have a large code base, if you make lots of poor decisions on performance at scale, those all add up, right? So having something like performance at back of mind all the time isn't necessarily a bad thing, but there probably is, a point at which you're just going overboard.
There certainly are things that you can, sort of tips and tricks you can learn to improve performance. A simple example in Go is you can pre-allocate a slice if you know how long it's going to be, and that saves a little bit of garbage collector pressure. And I do that as a matter of habit, even though I know 90% of the time those slices never grow beyond 3 elements, and that nobody cares. But it's just a simple idiom to just kind of do it all the time. And you have the same thing in JavaScript. There's 100 different ways to loop over group of objects in your DOM or whatever, and some of them are faster than others or whatever. You just kind of learn the basic heuristics to do the faster version most of the time, as long as it's not terribly ugly. And I think that's appropriate and fine. What I'm concerned about, though, is the idea that okay, we have two classes or two objects or two functions, whatever your language gives you. They kind of do different things, but it's slow because they're separated. If we would merge those together and violate the SRP and whatever, we could get it 15 times faster. Okay, that's fine if you need that performance. If you need 15 times faster, go ahead and do that. But chances are you don't, and you could observe clean code principles and readable code and separation of concerns. And yes, it's 15 times slower, so now it takes 15 nanoseconds instead of 1, and nobody ever cares.
Awesome. Well, I think we've had a really good back and forth. Let's see here. Is there any other points that we could? Well, I don't think so. I think we've probably exhausted this. I don't know that we necessarily came to a conclusion other than you could have it both ways, but we both presented well-argued cases and defended our positions, and now we are going to hand it over to our viewers. Do you think that we should favor code readability over writability? We want to hear about it in the comments. So thank you to our guest, Jonathan Hall, for joining me today. And to our viewers, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And we'll catch you next time on the next thrilling installment of Rated.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, thanks so much for watching. If you want to see more from EITR, just hit like and subscribe.